Hi, this is Andrea. Following two incredible previous seasons, I am back with season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. If you're listening or watching for the first time, I am the mother to a beautiful autistic daughter with whom I learn a whole lot every day. This has been my motivation to found and host the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. So join me and my guests on this mission to raise awareness and increase understanding. Together, let's make this world one that embraces and accepts difference. Welcome to the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Please welcome this month's guest of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast, Professor Clare Mackay, aka the Trick Prof. I met Clare at the Department of Psychiatry where we both work, as she is the lead of the dementia theme at the Oxford Health BRC. I immediately thought that Clare was special because dementia is a mental health condition close to my heart, since one of my grandmothers had it and I was heavily involved in her care in the last years of her life. So in summer, I heard at work that Clare was organizing a conference focused on BFRBs. And one evening I was at home watching the news on BBC South Today when I saw Clare on TV. Seeing a renowned scientist like Clare sharing with the world that she lives with a body-focused repetitive behavior impressed me very much and made me curious to learn more, having bit my nails and picked on my skin for most of my life. So I got a ticket to the second day of the first ever BFRB conference held in the UK that Clare organized in collaboration with BFRB UK and Ireland. I was astonished by learning how similar the journey of those with BFRBs is with the journey of parents of neurodivergent children. And also that there is a strong connection with neurodivergence. It was an amazing and unforgettable day. So I invited Clare as a guest of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast, and I have no doubt that by the end of the episode, you will admire her as much as I do. This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Today, I have the absolute privilege to be sitting side by side with University of Oxford's Imaging Neuroscience Professor Clare Mackay. Hi, Clare.
Hi, Andrea. Thank you for inviting me into your lovely home studio.
Thank you so much for being here. It's as I said, it's an absolute pleasure to have you here with me. So today's episode will slightly diverge from neurodiversity, but at the end of it, you will understand that it won't be as different because we will focus on BFRBs, which are body-focused repetitive behaviors, and that's why Clare is here to tell us all about it. So, Clare, before we dive in BFRBs, can you just tell me if you have any experience, connection, or involvement with anyone who is neurodivergent?
Yeah, so I would say that I'm kind of on a journey of discovery about neurodiversity personally. In my immediate family, there are no diagnoses, but there are definitely traits. And in my wider family, there's quite a lot of neurodiversity. So I'm quite used to living in a world where we think carefully about different needs and what different people need to feel okay and feel safe in a space.
Yeah. It's good to see that more and more of us have that understanding and that awareness.
Yeah.
And so BFRBs, maybe we should start by, I said that it stands for body-focused repetitive behaviors, but can we start telling our audience exactly what they are?
Yeah, body-focused repetitive behaviours are behaviours like picking, pulling and biting of hair or skin or nails. We all do these things a bit, so they are normal behaviours. But for some people, for some reason, once we start, we can't stop. And so people with BFRBs, particularly those who've reached the level of a disorder, are people who can't stop picking or pulling or biting at their hair or skin or nails to the extent that it's causing injury or damage or bald spots and causing a lot of distress to live with.
And I understand that you have that same personal experience with trichotillomania.
Yes, so the body-focused repetitive behaviours that are officially recognised in the diagnostic manual are hair pulling or trichotillomania and skin picking or dermatillomania, also called excoriation disorder, and all of the terminology is horrendous around this area. So I tend to use hair pulling and skin picking and nail biting just to simplify what it is that we're talking about. And yes, I have suffered from hair pulling since I was about 12 years old, and I've always bitten my nails. And so BFRBs have kind of been with me forever, but it's been the hair pulling that caused me a lot of distress to live with. And I have suffered from uncontrollable urges to pull out my eyelashes, eyebrows, and hair from the top of my head for 4 decades.
So I guess this is what kind of motivated you to start these new research projects. And actually, the reason why now there is, I forgot to mention this at the beginning, that Claire is the Trich Prof, right?
Yeah. So I started out doing a degree in psychology in the 1990s, and I got very quickly into neuroimaging as being the tool that I have used to study a range of diseases and disorders over the years. For the last 15 years, I've been mostly studying dementia and aging. But about 2 years ago, I kind of hit the wall a bit and was feeling like I was struggling with motivation. It kind of coincided with COVID and menopause and just a general feeling of needing to get off the hamster wheel for a little while. And when I did get off the hamster wheel, so I took some time out, I took the summer off, I took some unpaid leave and spent the summer at home with my then 9-year-old son, and we had lots of fun. And when I came back to work, it slowly emerged for me, actually. It wasn't a kind of an immediate overnight thing, but it slowly emerged that I've got this 30 years of studying the human brain and 40 years of living with this hidden disorder. And maybe it was time for me to think about putting those two things together and seeing if I could lift the lid on this set of disorders that so little is known about, and so many people who suffer from it suffer in silence because there's so much shame associated with it.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, that's brilliant. That's a brilliant initiative. And yeah, sometimes we need to take some time off to come up with these creative ideas. And I'm pretty sure that those who live with BFRBs are extremely grateful to you for bringing up this study. And I do understand as well that you've been collaborating with BFRB UK and Ireland. How did this collaboration came about?
So the collaboration with BFRB UK and Ireland started with just one connection. I had just started the Trich Prof as a handle. So I just created a Twitter account and an Instagram account with this name, and was making my first sort of baby steps of putting my voice into the world, still slightly hidden, so still with a slight separation between that and my real identity. But somebody called Caroline Harbison found me. So she is she's the treasurer of BFRB UK and Ireland. She was a research assistant in the Department of Experimental Psychology in Oxford, and she spotted my Trich Prof, and she sent me an email. And so we met up in a coffee shop in Jericho in Oxford and talked about BFRBs. She also has trichotillomania. And I'd been sitting there for a little while before I realised that this was the first time in my life I'd sat in a room with somebody else who knew exactly how it feels to have uncontrollable urges to pull out my hair. And I could feel my world changing as a result of this first interaction. So in that very first interaction, Caroline who is a researcher. She's now doing a PhD in Amsterdam. But she said, wouldn't it be amazing if we could have a research symposium? And as somebody who's a theme leader in the BRC in which we both work, I thought, well, we can have a research symposium. That's something we can just make happen. And so that was kind of a beginning. And so Caroline was the person who introduced me to the rest of the BFRB UK and Ireland team, and Bridget Bradley, who's Dr. Bridget Bradley, who's a lecturer in social anthropology at the University of St Andrews. She chairs the charity and is an amazing human being, and we connected very quickly, and could find common cause very quickly. And so it was the start of what's the most fantastic collaboration between myself and the whole of the BFRB UK and Ireland team, and it just feels like we make each other stronger.
Yeah, it's very important that we have those who truly understand us by our side. Absolutely. Because it makes a huge difference. Yeah. It takes away that feeling of loneliness, and yes, it does have a positive impact.
And that isolation that we feel when we suffer from something that causes a lot of shame, I think one of the biggest consequences of that is that feeling of isolation. Shame keeps us silent. It sort of creates a sort of heavy blanket over our feeling of being able to express ourselves. And we inevitably end up feeling very isolated. So that connection that you can get through community, I think that's almost the most important thing. The best thing we can do for ourselves is to find other people who suffer the same struggles and with whom we can really connect. And it just makes life better.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Absolutely, absolutely. And Claire, why do you think BFRBs have been so understudied in the past?
So I think that BFRBs are body-focused repetitive behaviours for reasons I don't really understand. But human beings, as we evolved, developed a whole bunch of social norms. It's part of being a human to have social norms that we adhere to. And along the way, it became not allowed to pick and pull and bite at ourselves, particularly in public. If we look over the fence at our closest evolutionary cousins, picking and pulling, biting behaviour is everywhere. I love going to Monkey World and just standing and watching all sorts of species of primate happily picking and pulling and biting at themselves, at each other, without any qualms whatsoever. But for whatever reason, picking and pulling and biting at ourselves is taboo as a human being. And so the fact that we actually all do it, we all do it as part of our regular grooming routines. So there's lots of socially acceptable picking, pulling, biting. We all, we groom ourselves, male, female. We all do at least a bit of grooming. And we all find a bit of pleasure in finding the grey hair and pulling it out, or finding the pimple that really needs a squeeze. And we do those things in private because those are slightly more hidden. But for those of us who can't stop once we've started, there's just a great deal of stigma associated with that. And so it kind of just goes underground. So that behaviour that we all do in private a bit becomes something that
you kind of have to put on a mask.
You have to put on a mask. You absolutely have to put on a mask. And when I think back to the ways in which I masked the consequences of living with hair pulling disorder, well, for me, the biggest source of distress was having no eyelashes. So I had no eyelashes at all for most of 40 years. And I sit in, meetings with all sorts of people. But there was always a part of my brain that was spent thinking, who's looking at my eyelashes? Who's looking at my eyelashes? And when I would find somebody who might be, and of course most people aren't, but nevertheless, there's a little bit of you that's always on alert for the person who might be going, I wonder why she's got no eyelashes. and I would stare them out. If I found somebody looking at me in a way that I found might unmask me, I would use the force of my personality and the force of my gaze to get them to look elsewhere. So there are all sorts of tricks and we come up with to mask. I'm also a nail biter, and so I've spent, I've got ways of sitting that means that my nails are not visible, and those have just sort of become normal to me now. But again, it's that little bit of energy that your brain is having to spend to keep your mask on so that you can feel normal in the world, which is, of course, is in common with many people with all sorts of different types of neurodiversity.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, absolutely. Did you, if I may ask, did you ever have anyone making any comments about you not having eyelashes or having a bit of an attitude towards that?
Very rarely. It's extremely rare that anybody would bring it up. I think because most people don't notice. And when people do notice, many people instinctively think, they might think something but not say it out loud. So it sort of it reinforces that sense that it needs to be hidden. But very rarely somebody would say something quite innocuous that would be hugely triggering to my fear of exposure. I have a particular memory of sitting on a sunny day out on the grass at the Warnford Hospital where we both work, having a chat with people over lunch. I was lying on my stomach, and somebody sitting opposite me said, "Your hair's really thin," which means that the efforts that I'd gone to hide the fact that I had a bald spot on the top of my head was failing. And I can remember reacting to that very strongly, certainly internally, reacting with almost panic, but externally, covering myself up and saying something to cut that conversation dead because we were not going to go there. But I remember the feeling really strongly of the fear of exposure. But that's actually been pretty rare. Occasionally a parent will bring it up, and they always get short shrift. That it never went well if either of my parents brought up my my picking, pulling, biting behaviour, because the shame is so strong that all you want to do is get out of that conversation, out of that situation, out of that need to be engaging with this, because it's too horrible, too painful to have to engage with. And so your parents get the sharp end of that.
Yeah, and I think I've told you about my nail biting. Not these days, even though I still pick on my skin and I bite the skin around them. But there was a time where everything was red, and I was biting the nails. I was biting, everything basically, and I had that same feeling. I was always hiding my hands and trying to make sure that people would not look at it. But I did have someone who was telling me to stop all the time, a work colleague, and that didn't help, because besides the self-stigma, because you're very self-conscious about something that you shouldn't be doing according to the norm, and then on the top of that you have someone else doing it, telling you to stop, and that doesn't help. So it's great that we have this awareness and that there is further research so that the understanding is there, so that we can be better supported and support those with BFRBs.
I call that the attribution error. We wrongly attribute these behaviours, picking and pulling and biting, to a conscious choice. So when somebody's telling you to stop it, they are wrongly making the assumption that you have chosen to do that activity and could choose not to if you wanted to. The brain mechanisms, as I'm just starting to find out, the brain mechanisms that lie behind the motivation and even the initiation of the behaviour to pick and pull and bite at ourselves, I don't believe go via our conscious decision-making areas of our brain. I think they are driven by things that actually lie in the subconscious. And so I think a big part of the stigma and therefore a big part of the shame is that every time we're told off, every time somebody says, just stop it, what that triggers in us is a sort of internal realization that we're doing something that we can't stop. And the lack of control that we feel about something, that it seems like the whole world thinks that we should be able to control this behavior. And we want desperately to be able to control this behavior. But that attribution area, that feeling that we are attributing conscious decision making to these behaviors is the biggest source of the stigma in my mind.
Yeah, and there's a lot of pressure, which only it cannot help with your mental health, right?
It really doesn't. And the shame that you feel as a consequence of that, well, we know that shame is a massive risk factor for anxiety and depression. And one of the things that are, one of the ways in which I'm trying to uncover our understanding around these disorders is that many people assume that these behaviors are a consequence of anxiety. So nail biting is almost synonymous with anxiety. And people assume that if you're biting your nails, you're feeling anxious about something. And I don't know whether the same is true for you and your nail biting, but mine really isn't. I mean, I obviously I get worried sometimes, and if I'm worried, then it is a risk factor for my BFRBs. But anxiety is not. I'm convinced that anxiety is not what causes my my fundamental urges to pick and pull and bite. It's an exacerbating factor, not a cause. But my goodness, can you experience anxiety and depression as a consequence of living with these disorders? And really, the work that I'm doing with Polly Waite in Oxford is all about trying to reframe actually the understanding of how shame sits between the behaviors and the anxiety and depression, which so many people end up feeling, not necessarily as a cause, but as a consequence of living with these disorders.
That's very interesting, because I heard all my life that yes, I'm biting my nails because I'm stressed. But with me, there was actually a pattern that kind of backs that up, because when I was in school, during school term, I was biting my nails, and then during the summer holidays, for example, I would stop. And I think that's what made me think, at least specifically to myself, was that, okay, you're more stressed because, you have tests, you have your homework, you have your routine. So that's why you are biting your nails. But it's interesting to...
It's complicated, and of course, essentially I think of it as a vicious circle, and so there is no doubt that anxiety is one of the triggers that causes that turns up the urges to pick and pull and bite. But once you tune into your urges in with a little bit more kind of curiosity about them, I notice, for example, that my urges are also turned up if I'm overexcited about something, or if I'm actually just aroused in any sense about something, then the urges turn up. But they're also just as likely if I'm bored, and that's really common in the BFRB community, is that we do a lot of picking and pulling and biting when we're watching the telly in front, sitting in front of the telly in the evening. We're not really, there's not really any, there might be stuff going on in our lives, but really in that moment, it's not anxiety that's causing us to pick and pull and bite. And one of the theories around these behaviours is that they are kind of an emotion regulation. They are a way of bringing us back into sort of into some kind of homeostasis. So if you're either overstimulated, and that might be stress and anxiety, but it might also be overexcitement. If you're overstimulated in any way, or if you're understimulated, then a picking, pulling, biting behaviour is a way of kind of bringing you back into some sort of equilibrium. And again, if we look over at our chimpanzee cousins, that's exactly what you see. You see that grooming behaviour in chimpanzees, and that's both to others and to ourselves or themselves, is done as a way of calming things down if everybody's been a bit overexcited about a banana or a new person coming, or a fight, or a new person coming into the troop and causing lots of noise. So grooming is a way that we calm ourselves back down again after a period of over arousal. But it's also kind of a default activity. So if you're not busy defending your territory or getting your food or rearing your children, then grooming is actually kind of a default activity that people go back into. So I think there's lots of drivers for picking and pulling and biting behaviour, and anxiety is definitely one of them, but it's definitely not the only one.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, that's very interesting. So are there any initial findings? You shared a few areas or aspects that you are looking to at the moment. Are there any initial findings that you were able to get already with the research?
Yeah, so it's very early days, bearing in mind that it's only 18 months ago that I started talking for the first time openly about these disorders, and so I'm really at the beginning of a journey. And so, there's I have only a tiny amount of funding so far, and so I haven't had a chance to really get going with the research ideas that I have. But nevertheless, with Polly, we have carried out our first study. And in that study, we were testing the hypothesis that shame is a mediating factor between the behaviour of hair pulling and the consequences of anxiety and depression. So that triangle that I sort of talked about earlier, which is part of the vicious circle. So my kind of overriding hypothesis here is that shame is it isn't just a consequence of BFRBs, but might actually maintain the sense of distress that our brains are in that causes the need to pick and pull and bite. So if we think of picking, pulling, biting behaviour as meeting a need, which is emotion regulation, then being in any kind of distress might increase those urges, and shame puts you in distress. And so the hypothesis is that if you can take shame out of that vicious circle, then maybe you can break the circle and you can reduce the urges. So that's just a hypothesis at this point, and the first stage of that was to establish this relationship between the behaviour and shame and both anxiety and depression. And so we did an internet survey of children and young people. I don't think I've said yet that adolescence is the peak time of onset for these behaviours. They can start any time, but they mostly start in childhood and particularly peak in adolescence. So we want to try and nip these behaviours in the bud for people so that they don't end up being a chronic, lifelong condition, which they have been for so many of us. So we're focusing on children and young people, and we carried out an internet survey. So we just put feelers out through the many communities that I'm part of online these days, and got responses got high quality, valid responses from 130 young people. And what we found was that shame significantly mediates the relationship between hair pulling and depression, but it completely explains, as in it takes away any direct relationship between hair pulling and anxiety. So what we conclude is that shame is a really important factor in the relationship between these symptoms. And with respect to anxiety, if you could take the shame away, there would be no relationship between the hair pulling and the anxiety that people feel.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. And Claire, if any listeners or any person in the audience would like to get involved in the research, what do they need to do?
Well, at the moment, the best thing I can do is say follow me on the various social channels that I have. What my aspiration is to establish a registry of people who want to take part in this research. It's all, yeah. It's step by step. It's one step at a time, and I have a lot of people getting in touch and wanting to get involved. And at this point, there aren't that many opportunities for people to get involved, but if you follow me, you'll hear first about the opportunities that come, and there'll be plenty more to come. So we have lots of ideas in the pipeline about looking at the more kind of biological mechanisms involved in the urges to pick and pull and bite, and those will actually be coming up quite soon. So follow me at the Trick Prof on whichever social media you like, and you'll hear that.
I will add the links onto the episode description as well, so that you can follow Claire. And you have co-organized the first ever BFRB conference in the UK with BFRB UK and Ireland. This was back in September. I had the opportunity to attend, and I loved it. It was such a good day. I learned so much. I related so much with all of you. I met wonderful people on that day. So thank you again for allowing me to be present. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, so I already told you about how the scientific half of the conference was kind of initiated, which was really just about wanting to bring people in. When I may just take one step back and say that shame ran the show for me for most of my life. And when shame ran the show, my natural curiosity was completely smothered. So I had some help to kind of deal with the shame that I carried. And once the shame was put out of the way, what came was my curiosity and my scientific knowledge and my interest, all of which had never been applied to this problem that I'd carried around all my life. I mean, to me, it feels kind of shocking in retrospect that I carried around this knowledge of how the brain works and my disorder and never put them together because shame was such a powerful squasher of my ability to think clearly about that.
But it's liberating, isn't it, when you acknowledge it and
completely liberating. And so once with shame out of the way and the curiosity starts to blossom, the thing that really strikes me is that this is actually a really interesting problem, and it draws upon actually quite a wide range of areas of science. And so to understand to answer the question, why do some people experience uncontrollable urges to pick and pull and bite, we actually need to draw upon lots of different areas of science. And lots of those areas of science have amazing people doing amazing work already, but not yet applying them to BFRBs. So the scientific day of the conference was very much motivated by wanting to bring people in and get them interested and get them excited, to open people's minds and to kind of stimulate ideas and stimulate collaborations and stimulate connections between people. And I mean, so far it looks like that was really successful. So there's lots of new stuff going on, actually almost more than I can quite cope with all at once. But nevertheless, there's all sorts of exciting things happening in relation to the science of behind that question, why do some people experience uncontrollable urges to pick and pull and bite? But from the get-go, with my partners in BFRB UK and Ireland, we were very clear that this is for our community, not just for scientists to talk to scientists, but for people from our community who have been so badly neglected by science and research and medicine and society, really. We wanted them to feel that this was their place, this was their safe place, that they could come and learn lots of things, connect with each other, and go home feeling less of that shame and more curiosity about their behaviours. So day one was quite it was a bit overwhelming. There was an awful lot of ground that we covered. I think that was okay for a first time, because we were starting something. It was starting something with a bang. But I think as we go forwards, we'll need to separate out those areas of science a bit and calm it down a bit. But the second day was really led by Bridget Bradley and the BFRB UK and Ireland charity. So we did a takeover of our department, the Department of Psychiatry in Oxford, and we created, Bridget created an incredibly inclusive space where people were invited to come. They were told that in whatever way they showed up was fine. That includes in person and online. We created an environment where people, many of whom will have been living with intense shame around these uncontrollable urges for all of their life, for decades, where it could come and meet each other and connect with each other and learn. And as I say, hopefully go home feeling less alone and more curious about their behaviours.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, and that definitely happened. I'm pretty sure I felt everyone's energy, and again, I have no words to describe it. I think I made a post at the time, and I was just in awe at the end of the day, and I still am. So yeah, it's wonderful to see.
I think that energy, and I obviously feel it too, and I think I probably emanate quite a lot of it these days as well. But I think it comes from when you finally connect after years, decades of feeling isolated. You can't help but generate energy around that. And because these disorders are so stigmatized and so hidden, there's a lot of that around. And so when you can kind of create an environment and people can come into that room, and we manage to gather together a number of people who've kind of worked through their own shame and tell their stories in all sorts of ways, through art, through social media, through all sorts of things, through development of products. And so because we were able to gather together a number of people who've worked through the shame to the extent that they've been able to do that, I think you can't help but feel that as a kind of contagious energy. And it makes people think, I don't necessarily have to stay under this cloak of shame. I remember lots of people have been in touch with me over the year and a half since I started talking about this, and there have been so many amazing messages. But one that really stays with me is a lady that wrote to me who said that hearing me talk about BFRBs has made her realize that she may never live without the urges, but she can live without the shame. And she said, it feel like I've been let out of my cage. And that's just amazing.
That's amazing, definitely. And did you have, how did, I don't know if this happened, but did you have any reactions or from the neurodivergent community? Did you have any neurodivergent participants in the study? Maybe not, but.
So I think there's a lot of neurodiversity in our community. We had a talk on day one from a neurologist colleague, Alison Parry, who is specialising in understanding ADHD in the context of clinical neurology. She described ADHD to this room full of people with BFRBs in a way that I think almost everybody kind of went, oh,
that makes sense. light bulb moment.
Light bulb moments. I think a lot of light bulb moments, and in fact, through an individual interaction, she also gave me a light bulb moment earlier on. And ADHD is not something that I'd ever thought about for myself, but boy, do I have a busy brain, and boy, do I have busy hands. And so, as so many women in particular have found in later life, the definitions of ADHD obviously didn't match us at all. But I definitely now recognize traits. And I recognize the need to take care of myself in relation to those traits. And it's enormously helpful to recognize those traits and to connect with other people through those traits. I sort of, at this point in time, I describe myself as having ADH, not D, because I don't think I would necessarily meet diagnostic criteria. And actually, in many ways, I feel that my busy creative brain has been more of a benefit than has held me back in life. But there are times when the overwhelm is overwhelming. And so I think an awareness of the traits I find incredibly helpful. I don't at this point feel the need to try and put a diagnostic label on that. But yeah, I think, and by the way, it's not just ADHD. So I think that these behaviours are also very common with people on the autistic spectrum. And so, like with other diagnoses or disorders, I don't want there to be a complete overlap. I don't think it's right for us to think of there being a complete overlap between BFRBs and neurodiversity, but there's definitely a big chunk of overlap on those Venn diagrams. Back to Ali Parry, who's the neurologist who told everybody on the stage what she told me the very first time we spoke, which was that in her clinic, all of her patients have BFRBs. Not necessarily to the extent of it being disordered, but some kind of movement of their hands or feet or whatever it is, their body has a repetitive behaviour and they can't control it and can't stop it. It might not necessarily cause them major problems, but the sensory needs are well known, well established in the neurodiverse community. So I think there's something about the sensory needs which is clearly in common, and I think there's something about the attentional state which is clearly in common. which makes that overlap in the Venn diagram.
That makes total sense. The other thing I think about, and this is my non-scientific or completely not scientific brain, and maybe you don't have an answer for this, but with stimming, it's another uncontrolled repetitive behavior that autistic individuals and children have. Have you thought about that for the future?
I have, and I think this. I mean, again, huge overlap in the Venn diagram. A lot of the stimming is body focused, and so I think that it isn't. Again, it doesn't necessarily cause kind of damage or cause distress, but that feeling of not being able to keep your hands still, or really an intense need to have input in my fingers, I very much identify with that. So I think that you know, if you think back to my chimpanzees, I often go back to my chimpanzees, but those chimpanzees, when they need a bit of calming down, they stroke each other, they groom each other. It is a very body focused, repetitive behavior. It's not causing any damage. It's perfectly gentle, if you like. But that need for repetitive behavior to regulate our emotions, I just think that's probably in all of us. But for some of us, that need is greater and we find it harder to control.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, I'm very curious to see what's going to come out of there in the future. How do you think this research will support the BFRB community or the results? How will it support the community?
So I go back to that question. Why do some people have uncontrollable urges to pick and pull and bite? And as somebody with a BFRB, particularly when we live in a world where we're always told to just stop it, when we ask ourselves that question, why can't I stop picking or pulling and biting? The answer that we give ourselves is unfortunately pretty negative. So we sort of tell ourselves that we're bad or we're broken or we're wrong. And unfortunately, that is what society says. Even the medical profession, in relation to these disorders, the narrative around these disorders is that the person is broken or bad or wrong. Interestingly, back to my chimpanzees overgroom when they're in distress. And the narrative around that in the animal literature is that the animal is in distress and we need to change its environment. So the narrative is for exactly the same behavior, two different species of primate, our narratives are very different. So we're quite cruel to ourselves as humans. So I think what I really want is to give people an alternative answer to that question. When people ask themselves the question, why can't I control my picking and pulling and biting? Well, maybe it's because I'm a primate and that's normal. Maybe it's because I'm a primate in distress and that's normal. Maybe it's because I am seeking stimulation through my fingers because I have a need that needs to be met. And maybe I can find an alternative way to meet those needs. So it's really all about giving people a better answer to the question, why can't I control these urges to pick and pull and bite?
Yes, and I also think that by raising the understanding, those of us, because I'm guilty myself, I think after the conference I stopped doing that, but I tell my daughter to stop biting her nails all the time. If we have the understanding, then we are also better equipped to help our family members, our friends who have BFRBs, right?
One of the things that you hear most often in the BFRB community is don't say just stop. We as people with BFRBs have been told to just stop all our lives. As a parent, I'm really conscious that I have to actively inhibit the instinct to tell my child to just stop when they're picking their nose or biting their fingernails or doing all of the other things that children very naturally do, that would come under the heading of body focused repetitive behaviours. And I'm very sympathetic to parents, because parents have a huge, enormous role to play. Unfortunately, so much of the shame that people with BFRBs live with comes from the parents telling them to stop and not being able to stop. But nobody's giving parents an alternative. So how do we haven't yet got to the stage where we can tell parents, here's the way to sit alongside your child, not to sort of bear down on your child and say, just stop, to sit alongside your child and say, it's really hard to stop that, isn't it? Because it's, you can't help it, and you can't, and it's giving you some sort of reward. But if you keep doing it, then there are going to be consequences which you probably won't like. So if you want to stop, then come and ask me and I'll help you figure out a way. And so but how is any parent supposed to know that unless we have ways of teaching them?
Of course.
And our natural instinct, including my natural instinct, is to tell your child to stop. When they're doing something you don't like, you tell them to stop. As parents, it's sort of our job to tell them how to be socially acceptable in the world. And picking and pulling and biting isn't socially acceptable in the world. And so unless we re-educate people, how on earth are they supposed to know any different?
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yes, absolutely. And have there been any challenges so far with the research? Have you encountered any obstacles that its initial stages?
Early stages. People have mixed reactions. So amongst my colleagues and my friends and my colleagues, some of them think it's absolutely brilliant and they want to get involved. And I've had incredible interactions with a whole bunch of people who are very keen to come and join the party and get interested in these disorders. Some have been less so. Some have kind of gone, oh, really? You want to do that? Or words to that effect, and that's fine. It's kind of it's a mixed picture. So I guess you have to feel pretty confident and strong in your conviction that this is what you're doing, to not hear those voices, the negative voices, too loudly. But I think I've kind of come to a stage of my career and my life where I'm happy to push through that. But in general, and particularly from wider community and all of the many interactions I've made through having done this, it feels like it just feels like there's everything needs doing, and there's a lot of enthusiasm to help and to get involved and get stuck in. So the major limitations are things like funding, like that we always face. And I've heard many times, you're never going to get funding for this, and I just think, I just think that we haven't framed the questions well enough, and that because the questions are interesting, why would interesting questions not get funded? So, and the distress is real, so why would we not want to help distressed people? So I think we need to do a little bit of re-education and frame our questions the right way, but it's one step at a time.
Yeah, one step at a time, and we will get there. So in terms of public awareness, and we talked about the parents' awareness, for example, how important do you think it is that society in general is aware of it, and what else can we do to raise the awareness on BFRBs?
Well, thank you for giving me the chance to speak to your audience today. I mean, I when I started getting interested in this area as a researcher, it was really quickly clear to me that in order to do the research that I wanted to do, I was going to have to go on a major public awareness raising campaign and an anti-stigma campaign, because most people who live with these disorders are hidden. They're not flocking down to their doctors asking for help, because they're not expecting that there is help available for them, because they blame themselves and everybody else has blamed them. And so many people who live with these disorders live with them in a hidden way. And therefore, it's really important to raise awareness in the public so that people even feel able to come to our conferences or to engage with us in whatever ways they engage with us. We can't even do the research that we want to. And I've talked about this as a kind of perfect storm. So with my clinical colleagues, I've heard them say, "Oh, it's not a big deal because I've never seen a patient." But I've also heard plenty of people say, "I can't go to the doctor because they'll dismiss me." And people who say, "I did go to the doctor and they did dismiss me." And so we've got the medical profession thinking it's not a problem because they don't see patients, and patients thinking they can't go to the doctor because they won't be taken seriously. And so it's kind of a catch-22 situation. And so there's a huge amount of awareness that needs raising. And just like with every disorder that's kind of come out of the shadows over the years, we're just at the beginning of that. And it's going to take a lot of energy and a lot of time and a lot of help from people who have platforms to put the word out there.
And it's not just the medical. I forgot the word. The medical world that needs it. I remember one of the things that struck me from the conference was to hear some of you saying that you wouldn't go to a hairdresser or to a beauty salon to do your nails, for example, because of all the shame. So, and I know that you've been in conversations with, is it the National Hairdressing Society?
National Hair and Beauty Federation.
Okay, I almost got that right.
Brilliant.
So yeah, it would be again back to thinking about how to raise awareness, how to help people. It became clear to me very early that the hair and beauty profession actually have an enormously important role to play. People with, damaged nails, damaged hair, damaged skin. Well, I'll speak for myself, but I know that it's common. It's excruciating to walk through the door of a salon and have to reveal to somebody, and this is a stranger, and this is somebody who's trained in hair and beauty, but they're not necessarily trained in a whole bunch of obscure medical conditions, to explain to them that that you really want your hair to be cut nicely, but you've got a big bald patch on your head, and that is, I can tell you that is absolutely excruciating. And so I've found my way through my own hairdresser and through now finding more and more people in the hair and beauty profession to the National Hair and Beauty Federation, and they have run a campaign on raising awareness about trichotillomania amongst their members. So they're the trade organisation for hair and beauty salons. But there's still an enormously long way to go. But the really good news there is that I keep finding people in the hair and beauty profession who really do want to help, and who really like the idea of helping people who feel terrible about how they look feel better. That is actually what they do. That is their raison d'etre. That's what they like doing, is making people feel better about how they do. And, there are clearly going to be some places that are not going to be the right place for people like us to go. But there are good people out there who really want to help us. And so with the National Hair and Beauty Federation, we're just in the early stages, and with the charity BFRB UK and I, we're in the early stages of thinking about sort of setting up an accreditation scheme where we might give salons badges, BFRB friendly salon badges. And so people with BFRBs know where there's a place they can go, where they're not going to have to explain it all. They're not going to be told to just stop it. Nobody's going to go ew when they look at them, and and other things like having a private space and maybe quiet times and all of those sorts of things to help people. So early days, but I do have hope that actually that will potentially give people a huge amount of support, and mostly make people with BFRBs feel that beauty's for them. It's not something that's only for beautiful people. It's for all of us. It's for all of us. And it can really help, because all of those things that turn down shame turn down urges. And so it actually really helps.
Yes. And I've seen, in my case, for example, from the moment I started having my nails done professionally, then I stopped biting them. So I think it goes back to being a bit of a vicious circle, isn't
Totally.
it? If you don't have that part of beauty in your life, then you're just going to continue doing it. But maybe if you have a safe place to go and do your hair, then you will like it.
Exactly.
And it will help you with not pulling.
I actually only very recently found my way to professional nail salon. And I have one of the things that stopped me from going to a professional nail salon is because coloured nails just aren't me. I didn't feel like I wanted really colourful nails. I wanted to have natural looking nails, but I also was made aware that it would really help me with my nail biting and potentially my hair pulling to have done nails. So I actually have heavily done nails. They're short because I relapsed recently with them. But they're professionally done so that they're smooth, and they've got no rough edges, and they're quite blunt on the end. So it makes it a bit harder to pick and pull and bite. But they look completely natural because I found somebody who would do that for me. But for most of my life, I wouldn't have dared ask. And so again, I think it's all about raising awareness and making the people in the hair and beauty industry aware that they could both increase and get very loyal customers, and really help people by offering these sorts of services.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. So, hairdressing and beauty industry. Here,
Take
Claire,
note.
take notes, please. Right, so now let's leave the research a bit on the side and let's focus a bit more on who Claire is. So my first question is, who is your biggest support in your journey?
Oh, well, that's easy. It's my husband. It's my husband, Paul, who's just always been enormously supportive. So when he's never been fazed by my BFRBs. He obviously knew about them from early on and just sort of accepted them as being a part of who I am. He is the sort of person who early in our relationship said, "What would you like me to do if I see you doing it?" Nobody had ever asked me that question before, and so I'd never thought about it. And the answer was, "Just give me a hug." And so that's what he does. He gives me a hug but actually mostly he doesn't pay any attention to whether I'm picking, pulling, biting, because it just isn't a big deal for him. But as I started to talk about, maybe I want to do this, maybe this is something that I want to do in the world, he's just been completely supportive of that. I have never had the slightest sense of, it causes him zero issues in terms of his own identity to have a wife that's going around the world saying this is a weird thing that I do, because he's just not somebody who would be affected by that. And at our conference, was a huge deal for me to have put it together and then to stand there that day in front of all of those people, completely exposed in terms of my own BFRBs, with my parents in the audience and friends in the audience. What I offered me that day was just to come along and be my emotional support animal. So he called himself my emotional support animal, and he was just there in case I needed to just hold on to him for a moment. And so, without a doubt, he's my biggest support.
Yeah, that's amazing when we have someone like that
in our lives,
like our person, and hugs make wonders. And
they are.
I think people should hug each other more.
Totally.
Because they make a huge difference. How do you treat yourself with regards to your well-being? We were having a chat before we started recording. That's very much needed.
Yeah, it's my biggest risk in terms of well-being is overwhelm, and I am somebody who has a very busy and creative brain, and I have always had an ability to juggle many balls. And again, that's actually led to me being able to do lots and lots of things, and so I'm grateful to have a busy brain. But the danger is always overwhelm, and through most of my life, really until menopause, although I was always aware of juggling probably too many balls, but I managed to keep them up most of the time. And really, it was really when menopause hit that suddenly the overwhelm became a bit more of a cliff edge, and so keeping myself away from that cliff edge is my biggest sort of well-being challenge. I paint. I do a lot of painting, and that's a great way of kind of coming out of my head and just expressing myself. And I really like just hanging out with my husband and my son. I spend a lot of time over the summer months sitting on the edge of cricket pitches, and we don't need to do a lot in order to just, we bod around together at home very happily. I potter around the garden and things like that. So calm times, making sure that there are plenty of calm times is a big deal. But the thing I know I need to do and would help me more is exercise, and I'm right at this moment in time, I'm in a bit of a rut with not getting into regular exercise. And so when things get tricky, when I can feel the overwhelm, when I can feel the cliff edge, then I do actually tune back into headspace and do meditation. And I find meditation enormously helpful. Even just 1 10-minute session can really pull me back from the overwhelm edge. And so it's I find that really helpful. But work in progress, as always.
As always. And I have to say that Claire's art is amazing. We have some displayed at the Department of Psychiatry, and worth to be seen. And yeah, with exercise, I totally feel you. I have had no time, even though this might be an excuse.
Yeah.
But my brain is as busy as yours. But having stopped it, you really feel the difference. I think until I actually tried something that I enjoyed, which was kickboxing.
Yeah.
I never really understood. Because I just didn't have a comparison. But then when I had stopped kickboxing because of a trapped nerve, I think that's when I started going down. And now I feel it because I know that I was feeling a lot better when I was exercising regularly.
And it's a little bit back to that ADHD brain trait thing, isn't it? So the kind of whenever I have got involved with exercise, I tend to then that tends to spiral into being a really big thing. So I had a big triathlon phase, for example, or I get into something and then I do it a lot and then I kind of burn out from it. But being able to establish just a nice steady routine doesn't come easily.
I know. I feel you. And Claire, who is your biggest inspiration?
Well, inspiration. I guess I'm always inspired by people who overcome adversity, and there are lots of good stories of overcoming adversity, and particularly when people overcome adversity and then use their platform, however big or small that might be, to give to help people, to help other people. And I wanted to emphasize the big and small because not everybody has a big platform and not everybody wants a big platform. And so people can do that in very big and very small ways. But somebody who I have been really inspired by is the cricketer, Freddie Flintoff. So I don't know whether you've seen his... He did the first thing that he did that kind of I just was amazed by was a documentary he did on bulimia. So he struggled with bulimia quite badly through his life, and he allowed the world to see that side of him. You know, this is somebody who's like a superhero in the cricketing world, and he does Top Gear, and he's a real kind of man's man, and boxing and all sorts of things. And there he was, completely vulnerable, talking about his mental health problems. And I just thought, wow, how brave. And it's a man, and it's a sporty man's man. And I just thought that is doing something so good for the world. And he's just done this a couple of series on a field. I think it's called Field. No, is it called Field of Dreams? Can't remember what the name of the thing is. But he created opportunities for working class people or a range of young boys from sort of disadvantaged backgrounds, including people with neurodiversity, including people with mental health problems, and just made it okay for them to be their whole selves in a world where they really wouldn't otherwise be. And so I find that hugely inspiring.
Yeah, definitely. I will check him out. I don't know much about cricket.
I think if you, my mum said the same. Like I don't want to watch Freddie Flintoff. He's a cricketer and Top Gear. But honestly, that series is incredible.
Yeah, I'll have a look at that, and I will link it as well
great.
For the audience to see if they want to. And if you were a superhero or had a superpower, what would that be, and how would you use it to make the world a better place for, in this case, people with BFRBs and neurodivergent people?
So when you sent me, thank you for sending me the questions ahead of time, and this was the one I thought, I don't think I'm going to have a good one for this, but then I thought of a good answer to this one, and it's back to my chimpanzees. But actually, no, I'm not going to. What I thought I would, my superpower would be is time travel. So I'm going to be able to time transport people, and I thought that I would give everybody the opportunity. Or maybe I'd make people travel back in time 20,000 years. We're going to travel back in time 20,000 years to a time when we, as human beings, were hunter-gatherers. We lived in hunter-gatherer societies. And this is before, in my imaginary world, the invention of social norms where it's not okay to pick and pull and bite. And we'll see that human beings, just like all other primates, do lots of picking and pulling and biting, and it's perfectly normal. But we would also see that human beings don't exist in groups bigger than 150 or so, because that's the natural sizes of our groups. And so for all those people who find it really hard to be in crowded spaces, and I think particularly about secondary schools where we're suddenly forced to be in with thousands of other people, that is not what our brains are designed for. So we would see that we live quite calmly because we live in small groups. And we don't have to make an enormous number of complex choices and decisions every day because life is relatively simple. And we'll see that that's, again, what our brains are designed for. I think that so many of the things that we struggle with are consequences of living in our modern world where we live with too many people doing too many things, too many choices, too many drives towards capitalism and all of those things that actually just our brains are just, we haven't given our brains time to evolve, to catch up, to live like that. And so I would take people back and show them that simplicity is a way to regain calm for ourselves, and that accepting all of the ways in which we're different is not, it would be normal and natural for us if we lived in a more natural way.
This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. Yeah, that's brilliant. I do believe that the simple things are always the ones that matter the most. But yeah, I like that you went back to your chimpanzees and to. Yeah.
I find an enormous amount of solace in my chimpanzees, as you can tell.
Yeah, that's great. And Claire, what are your hopes for the future of the research in this area, particularly regarding the connection with neurodiversity?
I hope, I suppose, one of the ways in which I think about BFRBs is in relation to other diseases and disorders over the years that have come out of the shadows. So if we think back 100 years, people with epilepsy suffered terrible stigma. There was an assumption that to have an epileptic seizure was to be possessed by the devil. And over time, we understand the brain mechanisms that cause people to have seizures. We develop treatments and the stigma goes down. If we go back 50 years, people with dyslexia were stigmatized and just written off as being stupid or not trying hard enough or etc. until we understand more about the brain mechanisms and start to be able to give people the support that they need. And now to have dyslexia is much less stigmatizing. If we go back 20 years, and then we see the birth of the understanding of autism, and then probably a little bit later ADHD, and we are on a journey with these differences or ways of being, which means that there's more and more. We're not there yet, but there's more and more acceptance, more and more recognition that these are just different ways in which our brains are put together, and that we need to put the right sorts of support around it, and then people live good lives. And I feel like BFRBs are at the beginning of that journey, and so we first need to start raising awareness, and we're basically right at the beginning. We need to do all of the understanding, all of the awareness raising, and that hopefully in the future, just like with all of those other things, as we know more, the stigma comes down and we recognize that this is just a thing that some people do, and it's not actually all that terrible.
Yeah. That's a great future to hope for. And finally, if your heart had a voice, what would it tell us?
One of the things that set me off on my journey was I was taking part in an inclusive leadership course, and I was given a definition of inclusivity, which is to be an inclusive leader is to enable the people in your team to bring their whole selves to work. And I kind of jolted when I heard that, because I thought, I've never taken my whole self to work.
Yeah.
So if my heart could say one thing, it's be your whole self. And that's doesn't always feel safe. So it's kind of easy to say, but hard to do. Find the spaces in which you can be your whole self.
Thank you so much, Claire. It has been such a great interview. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did. And hopefully you'll be back soon in 1 year or two to tell us how the research on BFRBs are going. And yes, I'm extremely grateful. I have no words to say how grateful I am.
Well, thank you, Andrea. And again, thank you for welcoming me into your home, into your studio, and to giving me an opportunity to raise awareness amongst your audience.
You're welcome. This is season 3 of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast. I am extremely grateful to Claire for such an amazing interview. I hope that it has been an insightful episode and that you learned as much as I did from Claire's real life story. I feel absolutely inspired by Claire's courage to open up herself with the aim of helping the BFRB community and ending the feeling of loneliness for many. So, regardless of what journey you are on, regardless of who you are, what mental or physical condition you may have, my message to you is be brave. Find your people, because when you do, amazing things can happen. I'll see you on that side in March with my guest, Rachel, who runs KidLinks, a community hub for children and families in Kidlington. Until then, there are plenty of previous episodes of the Neurodiverse Voices podcast for you to listen or watch on Spotify, YouTube, and Apple Podcasts. And remember to subscribe and follow. See you soon. Bye.